There is an hour that belongs to people who have already tried everything reasonable. It is not the hour you go to bed. It is the one that arrives afterward, when the house has finished its small noises and the traffic has thinned to single cars, and you are lying in the dark with your eyes open, doing arithmetic on how much of the night is left. You are not in crisis. That is the strange part. If you were in crisis, there would be something to do. You are simply awake, and your mind has begun to go over the day, and then over the year, and then over a conversation from 11 years ago that has no bearing on anything at all. Tonight, we are going to keep company with a man who knew that hour extremely well, and who did something about it that almost nobody in his position would have done. He was 31 years old. He was, by common agreement among the people qualified to judge, one of the 4 or 5 most gifted physicists alive. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize. And in the winter of 1932, he sat down and wrote a letter to a psychiatrist in Zurich, saying in effect that he had reached the end of what his own intelligence could do for him. That letter began a correspondence that ran for 26 years. It ended only when the physicist died. Out of it came a book that both men knew would damage their reputations, and which they published anyway, because they had spent a quarter of a century circling something they could not make go away. The idea in that book is the reason you may have heard the word synchronicity. It is one of the most borrowed and least understood words in modern psychology. Almost everything said about it in public is wrong, or at least much softer and more comfortable than what the two men actually argued. So we are going to go slowly. There is no hurry at all. We have 4 hours, and you are not required to be awake for any particular part of them. Some of this will be biography, because the story is genuinely remarkable, and because ideas that come out of a real crisis are easier to hold than ideas that come out of nowhere. Some of it will be careful, patient explanation, and some of it, near the end, will be about you lying there, and what a sensible person is supposed to do with the small coincidences that occasionally arrive in a life and refuse to be entirely forgotten. You do not need to follow the argument. If you drift, you drift. The voice will keep going, and the ideas will still be here, and nothing depends on your attention. Let us begin with the man who could not sleep. Chapter 2. A physicist at 31. His name was Wolfgang Pauli. He was born in Vienna in the spring of 1900, which is a convenient birthday for a person whose life would be spent on the physics of the 20th century, since he was almost exactly as old as the century itself. His father was a professor of chemistry who had changed the family name and converted from Judaism before the boy was born. His mother was a writer and a pacifist, a woman of strong political convictions who worked for a Viennese newspaper. His godfather was Ernst Mach, the physicist and philosopher whose criticism of Newton helped clear the ground for relativity. That is an unusual set of adults to be handed at birth. He was, even among prodigies, conspicuous. The often repeated story is that as a schoolboy, he sat in the back of a lecture reading a paper by Einstein under the desk. At 18, he went to Munich to study under Arnold Sommerfeld, who was the great teacher of theoretical physics in that generation. At 20, Sommerfeld asked him to write the encyclopedia article on relativity. He produced 237 pages. Einstein read it and remarked, with what appears to have been genuine astonishment, that nobody would guess the author was 21 years old. He was also, from very early on, feared. Pauli had a mind that found the weak point in an argument the way water finds a crack. He would sit in seminars and shake his head slowly while a colleague spoke. His verdicts entered the folklore of physics. The most famous of them, delivered on a paper so muddled that it could not even be evaluated, was that it was not even wrong. Physicists still use the phrase, very few of them know they are quoting a man who was, at the time he coined that kind of judgment, privately coming apart. That is the thing to hold on to as we go. The severity was real. So was the collapse. They were not two different men. He did his great work young. In 1925, he formulated what is now called the Pauli exclusion principle, which is the reason matter has structure at all. It is worth understanding roughly because it is one of the few pieces of physics that has a direct bearing on the fact that you are lying on a mattress rather than sinking through it. The principle says that no two electrons in an atom can occupy the same quantum state. They are forbidden from crowding into the same lowest configuration. So they stack. They fill one shell, and then the next, and then the next. That stacking is what produces the periodic table, which is to say the difference between iron and oxygen and carbon, which is to say chemistry, which is to say everything. Without that principle, all the electrons in every atom would collapse into the lowest available state, and matter as we know it would not exist. The universe would be a kind of undifferentiated soup. He worked this out at 25. He received the Nobel Prize for it 20 years later, in 1945, and Einstein was the one who nominated him. 5 years after the exclusion principle, he did something even stranger. There was a problem in beta decay. Energy appeared to be going missing. Rather than abandon the conservation of energy, which some very serious people were prepared to do, Pauli proposed in 1930 that an undetected particle was carrying the energy away. It had no charge. It had almost no mass. It interacted with essentially nothing. He was embarrassed by the suggestion. He wrote that he had done a terrible thing, postulating a particle that could not be detected. It took 26 years before anyone detected it. We call it the neutrino, and something on the order of 100 trillion of them are passing through your body as you lie there, and have been all your life, and not one of them has ever touched you. That is who wrote the letter. Not a confused man, not a man short of intellectual resources, a man who had twice been right about the invisible. Chapter 3. What a mind like that is for. It is worth pausing on what it is like to be that kind of thinker, because it has everything to do with what went wrong. Pauli's gift was critical. He was not primarily a builder of grand systems. He was the man you took your idea to when you wanted to know whether it was actually any good. And he would tell you, and he would be right, and it would not be pleasant. His colleagues called him the conscience of physics. Niels Bohr, who was the closest thing the field had to a father figure, relied on him precisely for this. When Bohr wanted to test whether an idea would survive, he would put it in front of Pauli and watch. Now, a capacity like that is enormously valuable when it is pointed outward. It is considerably less pleasant when it turns and points at you. Because the same faculty that dismantles a colleague's paper will dismantle your own reasons for anything. It will take your motives apart. It will find the vanity in your generosity, and the fear in your ambition, and the self-deception in your ordinary, comfortable account of yourself. And it will be right about a good deal of it, which is the trouble. A dishonest critic can be dismissed. An honest one cannot. If you have a mind that is unusually good at finding what is wrong with things, you will eventually turn it on yourself, and you will find plenty, because there is plenty in everyone. And unlike a paper, you cannot withdraw yourself from publication. This is not a rare condition. It is close to being the standard condition of intelligent people who lie awake. The intelligence does not protect you. It supplies you. Many people listening to this will recognize something in it. The mind that is good at analysis does not stop being good at analysis at 11 at night. It simply runs out of external material and starts on the internal supply. And the internal supply is inexhaustible. Pauli had the most refined version of that instrument anyone had built in his generation. And in 1927, the conditions arrived that turned it fully around. Chapter 4. The year everything went, in November of 1927, Pauli's mother took her own life. She was 48. She had discovered that her husband, Pauli's father, had been involved with a much younger woman, a sculptor whom he married shortly afterwards. Pauli was 27. He was close to his mother. The accounts of his reaction are not dramatic, which is often how these things go with people trained to be precise. He did not fall apart in public. He went to work. He wrote papers. He was, if anything, sharper than before. His father remarried quickly. Pauli referred to his stepmother in terms that made his feelings unmistakable and which do not need repeating. The household he had come from ceased to exist. 2 years later, in December of 1929, he married a cabaret dancer named Keith Deppner. She was in love with a chemist at the time of the wedding and had told Pauli so. The marriage lasted slightly under a year. She left him for the chemist. Pauli's remark afterwards was that if she had taken a bullfighter, he might have understood it, but a chemist was an insult. That joke is very characteristic, and it is also a door closing. He was making the failure into a line. That is what a certain kind of clever person does with pain. You get the joke in first, before anyone else can say anything, and the joke seals the whole thing away where it cannot be looked at. In the same period, he formally left the Catholic Church, in which he had been raised without conviction. So within roughly 36 months, he lost his mother, his father as he had understood him, his home, his wife, and his nominal religion. And he kept working. That is the part that should be underlined. His output during those years was excellent. He proposed the neutrino in the middle of it. From the outside, from the point of view of the profession, nothing whatever was wrong. This is worth sitting with, because it is very common and very rarely described. A life can be structurally intact and internally uninhabitable. The job is fine. The reputation is fine. The papers are good. And the person inside is conducting an emergency that has no external symptoms at all until it does. Chapter 5. The nights in Hamburg and Zurich. The symptoms, when they arrived at night. He drank. Not in the manner of a man relaxing, but in the manner of a man attempting to switch off an instrument. He went out into the parts of Hamburg and later Zurich where a professor was not expected to be seen, and he got into arguments, and on at least some occasions into physical fights. He was thrown out of bars. He was, by his own account and by the accounts of the people around him, becoming somebody his colleagues would not have recognized from the seminar room. He could not sleep. When he did sleep, he dreamed intensely and remembered the dreams, and the dreams disturbed him more than the insomnia did. He considered suicide. He said so later, without embellishment. And here is where the story becomes genuinely unusual, because of what he did next. He did not in the end decide that this was a private matter to be endured with dignity. He did not decide that a serious man does not consult psychiatrists. He did not decide that his difficulty was beneath the attention of a mind trained on the structure of the atom. He looked at his own situation with exactly the same coldness he would have applied to a flawed paper, and he concluded that the analysis was failing and that outside intervention was required. His father, of all people, suggested he see somebody. The somebody was a psychiatrist in Zurich named Carl Gustav Jung, who at that time was 56 years old, internationally known and running a practice on the lake at Kusnacht. In January of 1932, Pauli wrote to him. Chapter 6. What it costs to write that letter. Stay on this a moment longer, because it is the emotional center of the whole story, and it is easy to hurry past. Consider what that letter cost. Pauli's entire standing in the world rested on the claim that his judgment was better than other people's. That was his profession, not his hobby, not his self-image, his actual profession. He was paid, honored, and feared because his mind was reliable. To write to a psychiatrist is to put on paper that your mind has stopped being reliable in the one place where you cannot get a second opinion. And this was 1932. There was no vocabulary for this that did not carry a stigma. Depth psychology was regarded by most physical scientists as somewhere between literature and superstition. Pauli's colleagues would have found the whole business faintly ridiculous. Some of them did, when they eventually found out. He wrote anyway. I want to be careful not to make this into a lesson, because the moment it becomes a lesson, it stops being true. But there is something in it, and it is not the thing you would expect. The thing is not that he was brave. The thing is that he was consistent. He had spent his life insisting that when the evidence stops fitting the theory, you do not defend the theory. You change it, however inconvenient that is, however much of your work it costs. That is the whole of his professional ethic in one sentence. When the data does not fit, the data wins. And when the data was his own life, he applied the same rule. His theory of himself, which was that he was a man who could think his way through anything, had stopped fitting the evidence. The evidence was the drinking and the fights and the sleeplessness and the thoughts about ending it. So he did not defend the theory. He changed it. That is not courage exactly. It is something more durable than courage. It is the refusal to make an exception of yourself. If there is anything in this whole 4 hours that is worth carrying, it might be that. Most of us hold ourselves to a standard of honesty in every area except the one that matters. We are rigorous about our work and sentimental about ourselves. We would never accept from a colleague the quality of evidence we accept from our own reassurances at 2 a.m. He would not make that exception. It nearly killed him, and then it saved him, and it produced 26 years of correspondence and one very strange book. Now, let us cross the lake and meet the other man. Chapter 7. The Man on the Lake. Carl Gustav Jung was 56 when that letter arrived. He had a house at Kusnacht on the lake outside Zurich, with an inscription carved over the door which said, in Latin, that whether called upon or not, God will be present. He had built it in 1909, and he lived there for the rest of his life. By 1932, he was internationally famous, and, in the eyes of a good part of the medical profession, permanently compromised. The reason was Freud. Jung had been Freud's closest and most important follower, the man Freud had privately called his successor and crown prince, the one who was going to carry psychoanalysis out of Vienna and out of the accusation that it was a merely Jewish concern. And then, between 1912 and 1913, it had broken apart. Over the meaning of libido and over a good deal else that neither man ever fully stated. After the break, Jung went through roughly 6 years of something he never named precisely. He withdrew from teaching. He kept his practice going. Barely. He experienced visions and voices vivid enough that he seriously entertained the possibility that he was becoming psychotic, and he wrote and painted the whole business into a red leather folio that was not published until 2009. He came out of it with a body of ideas, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process he called individuation. He also came out of it with a settled conviction that whatever happens in that territory is not merely a malfunction to be corrected, but a process with a direction. That is the man Pauli wrote to, not a neutral technician, a person who had been down the same shaft and come back up with a map, and who was frank about the map being provisional. There is a symmetry here that both of them noticed later, and neither of them made too much of. Each had been, in his 30s, the most promising person in his field. Each had come apart. Each had been left to work out privately what to do about it. Jung's reputation, incidentally, has not been improved by his admirers. He is now quoted constantly by people who have not read him, in the form of short, bracing sentences about facing your shadow. The actual writing is difficult, digressive, sometimes obscure, and much more cautious than the quotations suggest. He was frequently unsure, he said so often. That caution is going to matter later, when we get to what he did and did not claim about coincidence. Chapter 8. Why Jung would not take him. Pauli's letter asked for an analysis with Jung personally. Jung refused. This is one of the most interesting decisions in the whole story, and it is usually skipped over. Here is one of the most celebrated scientific minds in Europe asking to be your patient. It would have been a considerable feather. Jung said no. The reason he gave was this. Pauli's mind was so powerful and so trained that if Jung analyzed him directly, Pauli would learn Jung's theory. And once he had learned the theory, he would begin, without any dishonesty at all, to produce material that fitted it. Jung wanted the dreams uncontaminated. So he sent Pauli to a young woman named Erna Rosenbaum, who was a physician at the beginning of her training in analytical psychology with a matter of months of experience. He instructed her, in effect, not to interpret. Let the man talk. Let him bring the material. Do not shape it. Think about what a strange arrangement that is. The most feared critic in physics was sent to a near beginner and told essentially to keep a record. Two things are true about that decision at once, and it is worth holding both. The first is that it was methodologically serious. Jung was worried about what we would now call experimenter effects and demand characteristics. He knew that patients produce the dreams their analysts want. Every school of therapy generates the material its theory predicts, which ought to be more embarrassing to all of them than it is. His solution was crude but real. Remove the theorist from the room. The second is that it was also convenient. Jung wanted this material. He had been circling the idea of the individuation process for years, and he wanted a clean, well-documented, high-volume series of dreams from an intelligent person with no prior exposure to his ideas. Pauli was, from that point of view, an extraordinary opportunity. Both things are true. The methodological care was genuine. The self-interest was also genuine. Most decisions that look noble in retrospect have this double structure, and it does not make them less good. Pauli, for his part, agreed to it. He went to Rosenbaum for about 5 months, from February 1932, and then continued on his own for several more. And then he and Jung began to correspond directly as something much closer to colleagues than as doctor and patient. Chapter 9. Writing them down. And now the physicist did the thing that physicists do. He kept records. Over the period that followed, he wrote down more than 1,000 dreams. Not summaries, not impressions. Detailed accounts? set down promptly in the manner of a man who had spent his life taking data seriously. If you have ever tried to keep a dream journal, you will know why this is remarkable. Dreams are the most perishable material the mind produces. They survive the transition to waking for a matter of seconds, and then they go, and what is left is a description of a description. To capture more than 1,000 of them with enough detail to be analyzable is an act of considerable discipline sustained over years. He did it because that is what you do with a phenomenon you do not understand. You do not theorize first. You collect. There is something worth taking from that, and it is not a technique. It is closer to a posture. Most of us, when something in our inner life is behaving strangely, do one of two things. We either dismiss it or we explain it immediately. Both of those are ways of not looking at it. The dismissal makes it go away, and the instant explanation makes it safe. And in both cases, you no longer have to sit with the fact that something happened which you cannot account for. Pauli did neither. He wrote it down and left it alone. There is a further point about the recording that is easy to miss, and which I think is the practical heart of it. When you write something down, you change your relation to it, not because writing is magical, but because writing forces a decision about what actually happened, as distinct from how you feel about what happened. A dream you have not written is a mood. A dream you have written is an object, sitting on a page, with details in it that you can check, and which will still be there in a year when you no longer remember having had it. The same is true of the coincidences we will come to later, and of most of the material that visits a person at this hour. Unwritten, it circulates. It comes back at intervals, slightly different each time, gathering weight it has not earned, because memory rehearses and memory embellishes. Written, it stops moving. It becomes a fixed quantity that you can be accurate about. Pauli understood this in his bones, because it was his profession. The entire method of physical science is the discipline of writing down what the instrument said, including the readings you did not like, before you have decided what they mean. The temptation in a laboratory is exactly the temptation at 2 a.m, to record the result you were expecting and to smooth over the anomaly, and to do it without any conscious dishonesty at all. He turned that discipline on his own nights. He wrote down the dreams he did not like, and the ones that made no sense, and the ones that were merely tedious, along with the extraordinary ones, and that is why the record is worth anything. A collection of only the impressive dreams would have told nobody anything, for exactly the reason Camera's collection of coincidences told nobody anything. The value is in the completeness. Jung eventually took roughly 400 of these dreams and used them as the empirical spine of a long study of what he called the individuation process. He delivered it first as a lecture at the Eranos conference in Ascona in 1935, and it later became the second part of a book called Psychology and Alchemy, published in 1944. In that book, the dreamer is anonymous. Jung describes him only as a young man of excellent scientific education, a natural scientist of high standing. He never named him. He was still protecting the man's professional position, which in the physics community of the 1940s would not have survived the association. For decades, Readers of psychology and alchemy did not know whose dreams they were reading. The identification became public knowledge only later, largely through the work of scholars going through the correspondence after both men were dead. There are people who studied that book closely for years without knowing that the dreamer was the man who predicted the neutrino. Chapter 10. What the dreams were like. I want to give you some texture here, because it is the middle of the night and abstraction is not what you want. The dreams were not, on the whole, about his mother or his marriage or the things a person might expect. They were geometrical. Circles appeared constantly. Squares appeared constantly. The relation between the two appeared constantly, in one configuration after another. A square inside a circle divided into four, a room with four corners and something in the center, a garden laid out on two axes, a clock with four hands. Four was everywhere. 4 seasons, 4 figures, 4 directions, 4 beats. Jung had a term for this ready-made, because he had been finding the same structures elsewhere for years. He called such an image a mandala, borrowing the Sanskrit word for circle, and he had encountered the pattern in Tibetan religious art, in medieval Christian iconography, in alchemical diagrams, in the drawings of patients with no knowledge of any of that material, and in his own drawings during his own difficult years. His interpretation was that the mandala is what the psyche produces when it is attempting to organize itself around a center. It appears, he thought, at moments of maximum disorder. It is not a symptom of the disorder. It is the counter-movement. Whether or not you accept the interpretation, the observation is testable and has been informally tested by a very large number of people since. Put a pen in the hand of someone in acute distress and see what they draw in the margin. A great deal of the time it is a circle, and then something inside the circle, and then something symmetrical. For Pauli, these images arrived unbidden, night after night, in a man who had not read a word of Jung. And there is a second thing in them that is stranger. The images were mathematical. The dreams of a mind in crisis were producing symmetry, division, ratio, and number. The unconscious of a theoretical physicist was speaking, so to speak, in the only language that man had ever fully trusted. Chapter 11. The world clock. There is one dream that both men treated as the hinge of the entire series, and it is worth describing carefully because it is genuinely beautiful, and because the effect it had on Pauli is the most concrete evidence in the whole story that something real occurred. Jung called it the Great Vision. Pauli called it the world clock. In it, there is a vertical circle and a horizontal circle, sharing a common center. This is the world clock. It is supported or carried by a black bird. The vertical circle is a blue disc with a white border divided into 32 sections. A pointer rotates upon it. The horizontal circle consists of 4 colors. Standing upon it are 4 small figures carrying pendulums, and around it lies a ring, formerly dark and now golden. The clock has 3 rhythms, 3 pulses. The first pulse, the small pointer, advances by 1/32. The second pulse, the small pointer completes a full revolution, and at the same time the middle circle advances by 1/32. The third pulse, 32 of the middle pulses equal one full revolution of the great ring. That is the structure. 2 circles at right angles to each other, 4 colors, 4 figures, 32 divisions, 3 interlocking rhythms, 1 golden ring. Pauli, who was not a sentimental man and who had spent his professional life resisting exactly this kind of thing, reported that the dream produced in him an impression of the most sublime harmony. He used those words. A man who had recently been getting into fights in bars and who dismantled papers for a living described a dream image as sublime harmony. Jung's reading was that the image resolved a problem the whole series had been working on. The dreams had been struggling for months with the relation of 3 to 4, which Jung considered a very old and very deep difficulty. Here the 2 rotating systems, at right angles to each other, are held in one construction, running on 3 rhythms across 4 colors. The opposition is not eliminated, it is set turning. There is also the obvious observation, which neither man made in quite these words. It is a clock. A man who could not sleep, whose nights had become an arithmetic of hours remaining, dreamed of time itself as something perfectly ordered, silent, and turning without strain, and the golden ring around it had formerly been dark. It is worth saying what makes this dream different from the ordinary run of striking dreams. Because a great many people have vivid dreams, and very few of them mark a turning point. The difference is that it was constructed rather than merely felt. Most powerful dreams are powerful because of their emotional charge, terror, grief, longing, the presence of someone dead. This one has almost no emotional content in the ordinary sense. Nobody speaks, nothing threatens, there is no narrative at all. It is a machine, described with the precision of a technical drawing, and its effect on the dreamer was nevertheless overwhelming. That is unusual, and it is what made Jung take the series so seriously. The dream is not about anything. It does not symbolize a person or an event in the dreamer's life in any way that could be decoded. It is a structure, and the structure itself is what carried the force. There is a further detail that is easy to pass over. Pauli did not understand the dream. He never claimed to. He reported an effect, not an interpretation, and he was careful about the distinction for the rest of his life. When he described it, he described what he saw and what it did to him, and he left the meaning to Jung, and privately he continued to doubt Jung's reading of it for years afterwards. He was, in other words, exactly as skeptical about the interpretation as he was about everything else, and it made no difference at all to the effect. That is an important separation, and it recurs throughout this subject. You can doubt every explanation of an experience while conceding without reservation that the experience occurred and that it changed something. You do not need to believe anything about the collective unconscious to find that moving. A mind in serious trouble constructed, unasked, an image of order, and the man it belonged to woke up feeling better in a way he could not explain and did not expect. Chapter 12. What happened to the man? The practical outcome is not dramatic, and I am not going to inflate it. Pauli did not become a mystic. He did not leave physics. He did not renounce his rigor. He remained a difficult, exacting, sometimes cruel critic to the end of his life, and his colleagues went on being frightened of him. But the drinking stopped being a crisis. The fights stopped. In 1934, he married Franziska Bertram, and that marriage lasted until his death 24 years later, and by every account, it was a good one. He went to Princeton during the war, having failed to obtain Swiss citizenship in time and being technically a German citizen with a Jewish grandparent, which made staying in Europe untenable. He received the Nobel Prize in 1945. He returned to Zurich afterwards, turning down a permanent position at Princeton to do it. And he never stopped writing to Jung. That is the part that indicates something durable happened. The analysis proper lasted less than 2 years. The correspondence lasted 26. It did not stay clinical. Within a few years, it had become an exchange between two people trying to work out a shared problem, with Pauli objecting, correcting, pushing back, and Jung revising. Pauli became, in fact, one of the very few people who could tell Jung he was wrong and be listened to. He did it repeatedly. He complained that Jung's terminology was imprecise. He objected that Jung used the word energy in a way that no physicist could accept. He pressed him for years to say what he actually meant. That is what a genuine intellectual friendship looks like, and it is rarer than either fame or agreement. And in the middle of it, running underneath everything, was a question neither of them had gone looking for. It had been sitting in Jung's notebooks since roughly 1920, and he had refused to publish a word about it for 3 decades, because he knew exactly how it would sound. We are going to spend the next hour on that question. It begins with an insect at a window. Chapter 13. The beetle at the window. Jung had a patient. She was, by his description, an extremely well-educated young woman, with an excellent formal intelligence and an unshakable rationalism, and the treatment was going nowhere. This is a specific clinical problem, and if you have ever known such a person, you will recognize it. She was not resistant in the ordinary way. She was not hiding anything. She simply had an answer for everything, and every answer was reasonable, and the reasonableness formed a surface that nothing could get through. Jung wrote that he had hoped something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. One day she was telling him a dream she had had the night before. In the dream, somebody had given her a golden scarab, a piece of costly jewelry in the shape of a beetle. While she was still speaking, Jung heard a tapping at the window behind him. He turned around. There was a flying insect knocking against the window pane from the outside, trying to get into the darkened room. He opened the window and caught it as it flew in. It was a scarabaeid beetle, a common rose chafer, Cetonia orata, which is a European beetle with a metallic golden-green shell, and which is the nearest thing to a golden scarab that the latitude of Zurich can produce. Jung noted that it was quite against its usual habits for the insect to have felt an urge to get into a dark room at that moment. He handed it to her and said in effect, "Here is your scarab." He reported that this punctured her rationalism and that the treatment could proceed from there. Now, What do we do with that? There are 3 available responses, and it is worth laying all 3 out plainly, because most discussions of this story assume one of them without saying so. The first is that it is a coincidence, full stop. Beetles fly at windows, people dream about jewelry. A therapist in a lakeside house sees a great many insects over a career of 40 years, and hears a great many dreams, and it would be remarkable if the 2 never lined up. We hear about the one occasion they did because it made a story. We do not hear about the 10,000 occasions a beetle hit the window while somebody was discussing their mother. That is a strong argument. It is probably the correct argument. Keep it. The second is that something occult occurred. The dream caused the beetle, or a hidden intelligence arranged the pairing for her benefit. This is the reading that circulates on the internet, and it is the one Jung is usually accused of holding. He did not hold it. He was explicit and repeated about it. He never claimed the dream caused the beetle. He never claimed anything caused anything. That is the entire point of the word he eventually chose, and we will come to it. The third response is the interesting one, and it is neither of the above. It is this: whatever the correct causal account, something happened in that room. A woman who could not be reached was reached. Her defensive structure came down. That is an event with clinical consequences, and it happened because of the coincidence, regardless of what produced the coincidence. Jung's actual question was never whether the universe arranged the beetle. His question was why an event with no causal connection to a person's inner state can nevertheless land on them with the force of an address. Why does meaningless coincidence sometimes not feel meaningless? And why does that feeling do work that argument cannot do? That is a much more modest question than the one he is usually accused of asking. It is also much harder to dismiss. And there is one detail in the story worth lingering on, because it is the detail that persuades me something genuine is being described, whatever its cause. Jung says the insect was trying to get into a darkened room. That is against the behavior of the animal. Setonia aurata is a day-flying beetle that feeds on flowers in sunlight. It is drawn to light, not away from it. A rose chafer attempting to enter a shaded consulting room in the middle of the day is doing something slightly wrong for its species, and Jung, who was an amateur naturalist of some competence and had grown up in the Swiss countryside, knew that and noted it. He could have left that out. It would have made a cleaner story without it. He included the awkward detail because it was true, in the same way he later published the astrological experiment that failed. Now, this does not make the event anything other than a coincidence. Insects behave anomalously all the time. That is what makes behavior a statistical matter rather than a law. But it does tell you something about the reporter, and in a subject this contaminated by wishful thinking, the character of the reporter is a substantial part of what you have to go on. The other thing worth noticing is the timing, which is the actual mechanism of the clinical effect. The beetle did not arrive that morning or that evening. It arrived while she was speaking the word. The interruption came at the precise moment of the utterance, and it is the simultaneity, not the object, that did the work. Had she found a beetle on her windowsill at home that night, she would have thought it a pleasant curiosity and her rationalism would have survived intact. Coincidence is not really about the objects, it is about the timing. That is why Jung put the word for time in the middle of the term he eventually chose. Chapter 14. Untrue. 30 years of saying nothing. Here is the fact about Jung and synchronicity that almost nobody knows, and it is the fact that should most change how you weigh the idea. He sat on it for about 30 years. He said that he had first begun using the term in the 1920s in seminars in private. He referred to it in a memorial address for Richard Wilhelm in 1930. And then he published essentially nothing about it until 1951, when he gave a lecture at Iranos, and 1952 when the full essay appeared. He was 76 years old. He explained the delay himself more than once, and the explanation is not flattering to him, but it is honest. He was afraid. He knew how it would sound. He knew that a psychiatrist who publishes on meaningful coincidence has handed his critics a weapon they will use for the rest of his life and for a century afterwards. He was completely right about that. It is exactly what happened. It is still happening. But notice what the delay tells you about the man. The caricature of Jung is of a credulous mystic who believed whatever was atmospheric and dressed it in Latin. The actual record is of a man who had an idea in 1920, found it too weakly supported to publish, and held it back for 3 decades while he looked for something better, and who then published it only when a Nobel laureate in physics agreed to put his name in the same volume. Whatever else that is, it is not credulity. Credulous people publish immediately. That is what makes them credulous. You are allowed to think the idea is wrong. A great many careful people do. But you should think it is wrong for the right reasons, and not because you have been told he was a man who believed things easily. He was, on this subject, close to the opposite. Chapter 15. The Man Who Counted. Jung was not the first person to take this seriously, and the story of the man who came before him is a sad one that is worth telling on its own. Paul Kammerer was a Viennese biologist, a contemporary of Freud, an excellent naturalist, and an obsessive. Between roughly 1900 and 1918, he kept a log of coincidences. He would sit in parks and public places and record repetitions. The same number appearing twice in a day, the same unusual name encountered twice, the same object turning up in 2 unrelated contexts. He collected around 100 cases and published them in 1919 in a book called The Law of the Series. His conclusion was that coincidences cluster more than randomness allows, and that there is therefore an unknown principle in nature which brings like things together, working alongside causality, the way gravity works alongside the other forces. He thought of it as a kind of attraction that operates on form rather than on mass. Einstein, who read the book, called it original and by no means absurd. That is a real quotation, and it is more generous than modern accounts suggest. The problem, and it is fatal, is that Kammerer was counting the hits and not the misses. He recorded coincidences. He did not, and in principle could not, record the vastly larger number of occasions when nothing coincided. Without the denominator, the numerator means nothing. This is now a first-year statistics point. It was much less obvious in 1919. Kammerer's end was miserable. His main scientific work concerned the midwife toad and appeared to support the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which would have vindicated Lamarck against Darwin. In 1926, a visiting American researcher examined the last surviving specimen and found that the crucial dark markings had been produced with injected India ink. Whether Kammerer did it or a laboratory assistant did it has never been settled and is still argued about. He denied it. 6 weeks later, he walked into the Austrian mountains and shot himself. He was 45. Jung read Kammerer and used him. He credited him, and he took the criticism of him seriously enough that he tried, later, to answer it, which is what the strangest chapter of this whole story is about. But keep Kammerer in mind for the rest of the night. He is the warning attached to this entire subject. The failure mode here is not stupidity. Kammerer was not stupid. The failure mode is a clever person collecting real observations in good faith with no way of knowing what the base rate is and building a structure on top of them that the observations cannot carry. Chapter 16. The cards at Duke. The second body of evidence Jung leaned on came from North Carolina, and it has aged worse than he could have known. Joseph Banks Rhine was a botanist who moved into psychology and set up a laboratory at Duke University, where, from the early 1930s, he ran experiments on what he named extrasensory perception. His method used a deck of 25 cards, designed by his colleague Carl Zener, with 5 symbols repeated 5 times each: a circle, a cross, 3 wavy lines, a square, a star. A subject in one room attempts to identify cards being turned in another. Chance expectation is 5 correct out of 25, which is 20%. Rhine reported subjects scoring consistently above chance, some of them substantially so, across very large numbers of trials. He published Extrasensory Perception in 1934. It was, for a period, taken seriously by a section of the academic establishment. Jung read it and was greatly impressed. He cited Rhine's results as the strongest empirical support for his own argument, and he made a great deal of one particular feature. Rhine reported that scores declined when subjects grew bored and rose when there was novelty, enthusiasm, or emotional stimulation. Jung took this to be crucial because it suggested the effect was not mechanical but depended on affect, which fitted his idea that these events cluster around emotionally charged material. I am going to be straightforward with you here, because this is a channel for adults and there is no benefit in leaving a hole in the argument for you to fall through later. Rhine's results have not survived. The replication record over the subsequent 90 years is, on any fair reading, a failure. Serious methodological problems were identified in the original protocols. Sensory leakage, in which subjects could get information from the backs of cards or from the experimenter's face and hand. Optional stopping, in which a run is ended when the numbers look good. Selective reporting of the sessions that worked. And inadequate randomization of the decks. Later meta-analyses have found small effects that vanish when the better-controlled studies are isolated, which is the signature of publication bias rather than of a real phenomenon. So, one of the two empirical pillars Jung built on has gone. That is not a small concession, and I am not going to disguise it. What is worth saying alongside it is that Jung himself, in the 1952 essay, was already uneasy. He noted that the effect was not physically explicable, that it did not weaken with distance, that it appeared to be indifferent to time, and he wrote about it in the tone of a man reporting something he did not fully trust. He was leaning on Rhine because he had almost nothing else, and he needed a number. That too is worth learning from. When a careful thinker leans hard on one shaky source, it is usually because the rest of the structure has nothing else to stand on. Chapter 17. The experiment that went wrong. And then there is the astrological experiment, which is the most embarrassing part of the essay, and which I include precisely because it is embarrassing. Jung wanted his own data. Cameras was uncontrolled, Rhine's was somebody else's. So he designed a study. The hypothesis was that in the birth charts of married couples, certain classical astrological conjunctions between the two charts would appear more often than chance allows. He gathered horoscope data for hundreds of married pairs and counted. The first batch appeared to show an effect. He added a second batch. The effect changed character. He added a third. It shifted again. In the end, he had roughly 400 marriages, and what he had was 3 subsamples, each showing a different one of the 3 conjunctions he had considered classical, which is very close to the definition of noise. Now, the honorable thing here is that he published the null result. He wrote that the statistical significance dissolved and that the results were, in his own assessment, a bit of a joke. But he then did something much odder, and this is the part where his critics have a genuine case. He suggested that the pattern in the data might have been produced by his own emotional investment in the outcome and by that of his co-worker who did the calculations. That is, he proposed that the experiment testing for synchronicity had itself been affected by synchronicity, and that the results kept moving because the expectations of the researchers kept moving. You can see what has gone wrong. That move makes the hypothesis unfalsifiable. If a positive result confirms it, and a negative result also confirms it, because the researcher's mood interfered, then no possible outcome can count against it, and it has stopped being an empirical claim. This is the central and correct criticism of the whole enterprise, and I want it stated clearly at 3 a.m, without softening. I will say one thing in mitigation, and only one. He published it. He had a null result and an awkward explanation, and he printed both in the same volume as a Nobel laureate, where every hostile reader in Europe could find them. A person running a confidence trick does not do that. Chapter 18. What he actually claimed. So let us now state the idea itself, carefully using the distinctions he actually drew. Almost every popular account gets this wrong, in a specific and predictable direction. It makes the claim bigger and warmer than it was. Jung defined synchronicity as the meaningful coincidence of 2 or more events, where something other than the probability of chance is involved. Take that apart slowly. There are 4 load-bearing pieces. The first piece, 2 or more events that coincide in time. An inner event, typically a dream, a thought, a premonition, a state of feeling, and an outer event in the world. The dream of a scarab and the beetle at the window. The second piece, no causal connection between them. This is the part that gets lost. Jung was not proposing a hidden influence, a subtle force, a transmission from mind to matter. He called it an acausal connecting principle, and he meant acausal. The dream did not summon the beetle. If it had summoned the beetle, that would be causation merely of an unknown kind, and the whole idea would collapse into ordinary physics with a mysterious mechanism attached. The third piece, meaning. The connection between the 2 events is a connection of sense, not of force. They mean the same thing. They rhyme. The link exists in the domain of significance rather than in the domain of mechanism. The fourth piece, which is easiest to miss and most important, the meaning is meaning for somebody. There is no synchronicity without an observer for whom the parallel signifies. Jung is explicit that the emotional state of the person is a necessary component. These events cluster, he claimed, around periods of upheaval, bereavement, crisis, and transition, when what he called an archetype is activated. So the claim is not that the universe sends messages. The claim is that there exists a category of event in which an inner state and an outer occurrence correspond in meaning without either causing the other, and that this category is not adequately handled by calling it chance. That is a much narrower and stranger proposal than the one people argue about. And there is one further piece of it which came from the physicist, and which is the reason the idea has had a much longer life than it deserved on its own evidence. Chapter 19. Cause and what it does not cover. To understand why a physicist of Pauli's caliber took this seriously, you have to understand what had happened to causality in his own field between 1900 and 1930. It had been the most secure idea in science, and then it had stopped being secure, and the people who broke it were the people in the room. The classical picture, which is still the picture almost everyone carries around, is the one Newton and Laplace left us. Every event has a cause. The state of the world at one moment determines the state at the next. Laplace put it at its most extreme, an intelligence that knew the position and momentum of every particle could compute the entire future and the entire past. Nothing is uncertain. Ignorance is the only reason anything ever looks random. That picture worked magnificently for 200 years, and then it broke, and it broke in the hands of Pauli's generation. Radioactive decay was the first clean case. Take a single atom of a radioactive element. When will it decay? There is no answer. Not an answer we do not yet know. There is no fact of the matter. The atom has no internal clock counting down, no hidden variable ticking towards zero. It has a probability per unit time, and that is the complete description. It is not that we cannot find the cause. There is no cause. Then came the rest of it. Heisenberg's uncertainty relation in 1927, which says that position and momentum cannot both be sharply defined, not because our instruments are crude, but because the pair of properties does not jointly exist. Bohr's complementarity, which says a quantum object presents as wave or as particle depending on what you ask, and that the two descriptions cannot be combined into one picture. And then the correlations. Two particles prepared together, separated, measured. The results are correlated more tightly than any account in terms of shared prior information allows, and yet nothing passes between them. There is no signal. There is no influence you can use. There is a correlation without a connection. That last one deserves a moment, because it is the most direct thing in physics to what these two men were circling. John Bell proved the relevant theorem in 1964 after Pauli was dead. And the experiments came later still. But the puzzle was already fully alive in the 1930s, and Pauli was in the middle of it. Einstein published the paper that made it sharp in 1935, and Pauli corresponded with Einstein about it. Physics had arrived, by hard experimental work, at a category of relation that is neither causal nor coincidental. Events that hang together without one making the other happen. Now you can see why Pauli did not laugh. He was not being credulous. He was noticing that his own field had been forced, against the wishes of everybody involved, to admit a kind of connectedness that classical cause could not describe. And here was a psychiatrist claiming to have found something with a similar shape on the other side of the wall. He did not conclude that they were the same thing. He was far too careful for that, and he said explicitly and repeatedly that the analogy must not be pushed. But he thought the parallel was worth investigating, and he thought that a century which had been forced to give up strict determinism in physics had no business being smug about acausality elsewhere. Chapter 20. The Tyranny of the Average. There is a second argument in Jung's essay, which is less discussed and considerably better than the astrology, and I think it is the strongest thing in the paper. It concerns what statistics does to the exceptional case. A statistical law describes an average. It tells you what a large collection does, and in describing what the collection does, it necessarily discards what any individual member does. That is not a flaw in the method. That is the method. Averaging is a procedure for throwing away individual variation on purpose, because the variation is what you are trying to see past. Jung's example is a river of pebbles. You measure them, you produce a mean weight, and the mean is genuine and useful. But it is entirely possible, and in a large enough river it is certain, that no single pebble in that river weighs the mean amount. The average is a real property of the collection and a description of nothing in it. Now apply that to a life. The statistical picture of human beings is real. It is the best tool we have for policy, for medicine, for prediction in the aggregate. But the individual case, in its full particularity, is precisely what that picture is designed to remove. And you do not live in the aggregate. You live in exactly one case, once, and it is the case that got discarded. Jung's point is that the exceptional event, the outlier, the once-in-a-life occurrence, is not adequately handled by being assigned to the tail of a distribution and forgotten. Statistically, it is noise, but it happened to somebody once. And for that person, it may have been the most significant thing that ever occurred. Here is where he places the wedge. He argues that our sense that such events are meaningless is not a finding. It is an artifact of the method we chose. We adopted a technique that deliberately deletes the singular, and then we concluded that the singular is not real, having built the deletion into the instrument. That is a genuinely good philosophical argument, and it does not depend on Rhine, or on beetles, or on astrology. It survives all of the criticism we have already made. It is worth being clear about what it does and does not establish. It does not establish that coincidences are meaningful. It establishes that the standard demonstration of their meaninglessness is question-begging. Those are very different claims, and Jung, in his better paragraphs, keeps them apart. And it lands, I think, in the small hours. Because at 3 a.m, you are not an aggregate. You are one case. And the events you are turning over are the ones that would not appear in any table. It is worth seeing how far this reaches, because it is not a point about coincidence at all. It is a point about the whole modern relationship between knowledge and living. Almost everything you are told about your life comes to you in the form of an average. The medicine works in 70% of cases. People in your situation typically recover within a year. The risk is small. These statements are true, and they are the best available, and every one of them is a statement about a population that you are being invited to apply to yourself. The application is not straightforward, and everybody quietly knows it. When a doctor tells you a procedure has a low complication rate, the number is doing 2 entirely different jobs at once. For the hospital planning its year, the number is exactly right and completely actionable. For you, lying awake the night before, the number is close to useless because you are not having a low rate of complications. You are going to have complications, or you are not. Jung's term for the gap was that statistical truth is not the whole of truth, and that a picture of the world assembled entirely from averages will be systematically blind in one direction. It will be blind to whatever happens once. This is not an argument against statistics, and it is important not to hear it as one. Averages are how we know almost everything we know, and the alternative is anecdote, which is worse in every respect. The argument is narrower. It is that the method has a cost, that the cost is the singular case, and that having paid the cost, we should not go on to say that the singular case does not exist because our instrument does not show it. A telescope that cannot see infrared has not proved there is no infrared. Chapter 21. The archetype as an ordering pattern. To take the next step, we need Jung's notion of an archetype, and I want to give you the careful version rather than the version that circulates. The circulating version is that archetypes are characters: the hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man, as though the unconscious contained a caste list. That version is not useless, but it is a considerable coarsening. Jung's actual claim is more structural. An archetype, he insisted, is not an inherited image. It is an inherited disposition to form images of a certain kind. The distinction matters enormously to him, and he made it over and over, usually in exasperation because people kept getting it wrong in his lifetime too. His own analogy was the axial system of a crystal. A crystal forms according to a lattice, a set of relations and angles which determines the possible arrangements without determining any particular crystal. Every snowflake obeys the hexagonal system. No two snowflakes are the same. The system is real, and it is nowhere present as an object. It is a rule of formation. An archetype, on this account, is like that. It is a formal predisposition, empty of content, which fills with whatever the individual life provides. Everyone has the disposition to form an image of the mother. What fills it is your mother, and the culture you grew up in, and the stories you were told, and the losses you sustained. So, an archetype is a pattern of order that shows up in psychic material without being contained in any of it. And now, the move that connects the two halves of tonight. If an archetype is fundamentally an ordering principle rather than a mental object, then, Jung argued, there is no strong reason to assume it can only order the inside. Perhaps ordering patterns are not confined to psyches. Perhaps what we meet as an archetype in a dream and what we meet as a symmetry in physics are two appearances of something that is neither mental nor material and which is prior to that division. That is the speculative leap. I want to flag it as a leap rather than let it slide past, because this is the exact point where the argument leaves evidence and starts doing metaphysics. But it is not an arbitrary leap, and it is the point at which Pauli became not merely a correspondent, but a collaborator. Because Pauli had spent his life with ordering principles that are not material objects and are not mental either. A conservation law is not a thing, a symmetry is not a thing, the exclusion principle is not a thing. They are constraints on what can happen, and they are as real as anything in physics. Chapter 22. The oldest pattern of all. Pauli's particular contribution, the one he pushed hardest across 26 years of letters, concerned number. His argument roughly was this: whole numbers are the oldest and most reliable ordering structures we have. They appear in the psyche in that we count, we divide, we recognize pairs and triples, we dream in fours as Pauli demonstrably did. And they appear in the world, in that nature is quantized and matter comes in discrete units, and energy comes in discrete packets, and the whole of quantum mechanics is a theory about integers appearing where classical physics expected a continuum. Number, Pauli suggested, is precisely a place where mind and matter are not two. You can call this Pythagorean, and Pauli did. He was quite conscious that this was among the oldest ideas in European thought, and he thought physics had circled back to it by a route nobody could have anticipated. Jung took this seriously. In his late work, he described natural numbers as an archetype of order which has become conscious, and he treated the small integers, particularly 3 and 4, as genuinely fundamental. Whether or not you find this convincing, it is not silly, and the reason it is not silly is the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. That phrase belongs to Eugene Wigner, a physicist who won the Nobel in 1963, and who wrote a famous paper about the fact that mathematics developed for entirely internal reasons out of aesthetic and formal considerations, with no reference to the world, turns out over and over to describe the world with staggering precision. Non-Euclidean geometry was developed as a curiosity and turned out to be the shape of space-time. Group theory was abstract algebra and turned out to be the classification of particles. Complex numbers were invented to solve equations that had no solutions and turned out to be indispensable to quantum mechanics. Riemann did his work 60 years before Einstein needed it. Wigner called this a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. That is a Nobel laureate in physics saying, in a peer-reviewed context, that there is something about the correspondence between the structures of the mind and the structures of the world which is not explained. Pauli was pointing at the same gap. He simply thought Jung might have found another edge of it. Chapter 23. 2 descriptions of one thing. There is a concept Pauli brought from physics which turns out to be the most useful tool in this entire discussion, and I want to hand it to you properly because it will still be useful long after tonight. It is Bohr's principle of complementarity. In quantum mechanics, an electron can be described as a wave or as a particle. Both descriptions are correct. Both are supported by experiment. They cannot be combined into a single consistent picture. And which one you get depends on the apparatus you use to look. Bohr's response to this was not to declare one description true and the other an illusion. It was to say that the 2 descriptions are complementary, mutually exclusive, jointly necessary, and both required for the complete account. The demand that reality present a single picture was, he argued, a habit rather than a law. Pauli was steeped in this. He had watched Bohr work it out. And he suggested to Jung that the relation between the physical and the psychological description of a person might be complementary in exactly this technical sense. Consider what that would mean. There is a complete physical description of what is happening as you lie there. Neurons, ion gradients, the slow drift of adenosine, thermoregulation, the state of your inner ear. It is exhaustive at its own level. It leaves nothing out that it is designed to include. There is also a complete experiential description. It is late, and you are tired, and you are thinking about something that happened, and the room is dark, and you would like to stop. Neither description is false. Neither reduces cleanly to the other. And the deep and honest observation is that nobody has ever produced a satisfactory account of how they are the same event. Bohr's move, applied here, is to stop demanding that one of them be the real one. Both are complete. Both are partial. Which one you get depends on the question you bring. This is not a solution to the mind-body problem. It is a proposal about how to hold it without either lying or going mad. It is the most durable thing the Jung and Pauli correspondence produced, and it is almost never mentioned when people talk about synchronicity. Chapter 24. The One World. The word they eventually reached for was borrowed, as most of Jung's best words were, from the alchemists. Unus mundus, one world. The phrase comes from Gerhard Dorn, a 16th century alchemist and follower of Paracelsus, whom Jung had been reading for decades. Dorn used it to name a unitary reality underlying the visible split between spirit and body, from which both had emerged and to which both could in principle be returned. Jung took it up in his last years to name the following proposal: that mind and matter are not two substances that have to be joined, but two aspects of a single underlying order which is in itself neither. On this view, an archetype is not in the psyche. It is a pattern of the unus mundus, which shows up in the psyche as an image and in the world as an event, and the two appearances can occasionally line up. That is the full theoretical form of synchronicity, not a message, not an influence, two windows onto the same room, and once in a great while you happen to be standing where you can see through both at once. Let me be honest about the status of this. It is not a testable hypothesis. It generates no predictions. There is no experiment that would distinguish a world with an unus mundus from a world without one. By the standards Pauli applied every working day of his life, it is not physics, and he knew it, and he said so. It is metaphysics. That is not a slur. Metaphysics is what you are doing when you decide what kinds of thing exist, and everyone is doing it, whether or not they admit it, including the people most confident that they are not. But I am not going to tell you it is science, because it is not, and Pauli would have despised that dishonesty more than any other fault available. What I will say is this: two men, one of whom had helped construct the most successful physical theory in history, spent 26 years trying to say something clearly, and this was the best they could do, and they knew it was not good enough, and they published it anyway. Which brings us to the book itself, and to the very strange thing Pauli chose to write about. Chapter 25. Pauli chooses his subject. When the two of them agreed to publish together, Jung's contribution was obvious. He would write the synchronicity essay he had been not writing for 30 years. Pauli's contribution was not obvious at all, and the choice he made tells you more about him than anything else he ever published. He did not write about quantum mechanics. He did not write a physicist's assessment of Jung's proposal, which is what everybody expected and what the volume arguably needed. He wrote a historical study of Johannes Kepler. The title, translated, is The Influence of Archetypal Ideas on the Formation of Scientific Theories in Kepler. It is a long, dense, scholarly piece with extensive quotation from 17th century Latin sources, and it is, on its surface, an essay in the history of science. It is also the most sophisticated argument in the book, and once you see what he is doing, it is rather beautiful. Here is the strategy. Jung's claim is that archetypes are ordering patterns which shape how a mind can construe the world. That claim is hard to test in a laboratory, but it has a historical consequence which can be examined. If it is true, then the great scientific theories should show the fingerprints of pre-rational ordering patterns in their formation. The discoverer should be reaching for a shape before he has evidence for the shape. So Pauli went and looked, and he chose the best possible case. The man who stands exactly on the seam between the old world and the new. Chapter 26. The man with the three. Johannes Kepler is the pivot of the scientific revolution, and he is much stranger than his reputation. He worked out that the planets move in ellipses rather than circles, which broke 2,000 years of assumption. He derived 3 laws of planetary motion from Tycho Brahe's observations, and those laws are exact and Newton built on them. He is unambiguously one of the founders of modern physical science. He was also a working astrologer who cast horoscopes for a living, a mystical Lutheran of intense and idiosyncratic piety, and a man whose mother was tried as a witch and whom he defended in court for years. And his motivation, from beginning to end, was theological. Kepler believed the cosmos was constructed by God according to geometrical harmony, and that the structure of the solar system was an image of the Trinity. The Sun corresponded to the Father, at the center, the Source. The sphere of the fixed stars corresponded to the Sun, at the periphery. The space between, through which force and light propagate, corresponded to the Holy Spirit. 3. The whole picture is built on 3. Pauli's point, developed with great care, is that this was not decoration added afterwards to a scientific result. It was the generative idea. Kepler's early masterpiece, the Mysterium Cosmographicum of 1596, proposes that the spacing of the planets is determined by nesting the 5 platonic solids inside one another. This is, by any modern standard, entirely wrong. It is also what he was doing when he learned to think in the way that eventually produced the correct laws. And it explains, Pauli argued, the single most consequential thing about Kepler: why he insisted on putting the Sun at the center and treating it as physically active. Copernicus had already moved the Sun to the middle, but for Copernicus this was largely a computational convenience. Kepler made the Sun the source of a real force that moves the planets, and that is the step that leads to physical astronomy and eventually to Newton. Why did he insist on it? Because the Sun was the father. The center had to be the origin of the motive power, because the center was God. He believed that before he could demonstrate it, and the belief came from an image of order, not from data. That is Pauli's exhibit. The most important structural insight in the founding of modern physics was arrived at through a symbolic conviction about threeness, held by a mystic for reasons that were not scientific at all, and which turned out to point in the right direction. Chapter 27. The man with the 4. And then Pauli does the thing that makes the essay remarkable. He gives the other side a serious hearing. Kepler had a critic. His name was Robert Fludd, an English physician and Paracelsian, a Rosicrucian sympathizer, and a defender of the older Hermetic tradition. They conducted a public quarrel in print in the 1620s. Fludd's cosmos was built on 4, not 3. His governing image was the union of opposites, spirit and matter, light and dark, represented as 2 interpenetrating pyramids or as a 4-fold division of the world. He thought in correspondences, as above, so below, the human being as a microcosm mirroring the macrocosm. Fludd's specific objection to Kepler was that Kepler had reduced the harmony of the world to quantity. Kepler measured, he counted, he turned the music of the spheres into arithmetic ratios. Fludd said this destroyed the thing it claimed to describe because the real harmony was qualitative and symbolic and could only be grasped by a knower who participated in it, not by a measurer standing outside. Fludd lost completely. Nobody in modern science is a Fluddian. The quantitative program took the world. Pauli's treatment is what is interesting. He does not gloat. He says, in substance, Fludd lost, and Fludd had to lose, and something real was lost with him. What was lost was the participating observer. Kepler's method requires a knower who stands outside the world and measures it, unaffected by what he measures and not affecting it. That detachment is the engine of 300 years of extraordinary success. And it is precisely the assumption that quantum mechanics broke. That is Pauli's punchline, and he was in an unusually good position to deliver it. The observer cannot be removed from the description. The act of measurement is not neutral. The clean separation between the knower and the known, which was the founding move of the scientific revolution, had failed in his own laboratory, in his own lifetime, in the theory he had helped to build. He was not saying Fludd was right. He was saying that the quarrel of the 1620s was not settled after all, and that the losing side had been pointing at something the winning side would eventually be forced to face. There is a general lesson in this that has nothing to do with mysticism, and Pauli states it with more care than anyone before or since. When a way of thinking wins comprehensively, we tell the story afterwards as though the losing side had been merely confused. That is almost never what happened. The losing side was usually holding on to a real consideration which the winning method could not accommodate, and which therefore had to be dropped in order for the method to work at all. The dropped consideration does not stop being real, it simply stops being visible, because the instrument that replaced it cannot register it. And then, eventually, sometimes centuries later, the winning method develops far enough to run into the same wall from the inside, and the old objection returns wearing new clothes and is treated as a startling discovery. That is precisely what happened with the observer. Kepler's method required that the knower be outside the world. Fludd objected that this was false to how knowing actually works. Fludd was crushed, and rightly, because his alternative could not produce anything. 300 years later, quantum mechanics was forced to put the observer back into the description, not for philosophical reasons, but because the experiments demanded it. Pauli's point is not that Fludd anticipated quantum mechanics. He did not, and Pauli says so. The point is that a dropped consideration is not a refuted one, and that a field which has forgotten what it dropped will not recognize the problem when it comes back. He also thought the 3 and the 4 were the same 3 and 4 he had been dreaming about in 1932. and that Kepler's Trinitarian cosmos and Fludd's quaternary one were the same opposition his own unconscious had been turning over while he could not sleep. Make of that what you will. But notice that the man had a considerable amount of evidence in his own handwriting, gathered before he knew what any of it meant. Chapter 28. The book. It was published in 1952 in Zurich under the title Naturerklärung und Psyche, which means the explanation of nature and the psyche. It appeared in English in 1955 as The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. 2 essays, Jung on synchronicity as a causal connecting principle, Pauli on the influence of archetypal ideas on Kepler. Jung was 77, Pauli was 52, and had held the Nobel Prize for 7 years. They both knew what they were doing to themselves. There is correspondence about it. Pauli was anxious about the reception and made revisions to distance his argument from anything that could be read as endorsing occultism. Jung, who had been sitting on the material since the 1920s, was under no illusions either. They published anyway. It is worth pausing on what a peculiar act that is at that stage of 2 careers. Neither man needed this. Jung's reputation was made. Pauli's was beyond question. Nothing in either professional life required them to attach their names to the least defensible idea either of them had. They did it because they had been arguing about it for 20 years and had reached the limit of what letters could do, and because they both, in different ways, held the view that an honest report of an unresolved problem is worth more than a tidy silence. Chapter 29. How it landed. Badly, in the way that matters, and strangely, in the way that lasted. Among physicists, the response was mostly embarrassed quiet. Pauli's colleagues did not attack the Kepler essay, they simply did not engage with it. It was treated as the eccentric hobby of a great man, filed alongside the personal peculiarities that great men are permitted. Several of his obituaries in 1958 did not mention it at all. Among psychologists and psychiatrists, the reception was worse. The Synchronicity essay confirmed what a large section of the profession already believed about Jung, and it was used against him and against analytical psychology as a whole for the next 50 years. Every subsequent attempt to have Jung taken seriously in academic psychology has had to carry this essay on its back. Among the general public, and this is the cruel part, it succeeded enormously, in a form neither man would have recognized or accepted. The word synchronicity escaped. It entered the culture, was picked up by the human potential movement, by the New Age, by 1,000 books about signs and manifestation and the universe conspiring in your favor. It became a way of saying that a coincidence was a message meant for you, which is very close to the opposite of what Jung argued. He was explicit that there is no sender. A causal means a causal. There is no one on the other end arranging your parking spaces. There is an irony here that is worth naming and then leaving alone. A man delayed publication for 3 decades because he was afraid of being misunderstood. Published with a Nobel laureate to armor the idea against exactly that, and was then misunderstood in precisely the manner he had feared, so thoroughly that the misunderstanding is now what most people mean by the word. Being careful does not save you. It only means that when you are misread, the record shows that you were careful. Chapter 30. The critics put at their strongest. I am going to make the case against properly. Because a video that only gives you one side is not respecting you, and because you can hear the other version anywhere, the first objection is the base rate problem, and it is the one that does most of the work. The number of events in a human day is enormous. Every perception, every thought, every name, every number on a passing vehicle, every song in a shop, call it many tens of thousands of discrete items, and multiply by the number of possible pairings between them, and then by the number of days in a life, and then by 8 billion people. Against that denominator, the number of striking coincidences that anyone actually reports is not merely unremarkable, it is low. If coincidences did not happen at roughly the rate they do, that would be the finding requiring explanation. The second objection concerns the selection of the data. Nobody records the misses. You dream of a golden scarab and no beetle appears, and you forget the dream by lunchtime. You think of an old friend and the phone does not ring, and there is nothing to remember. Only the hits leave a trace, so the collection is contaminated at the point of formation, and no amount of care afterwards can decontaminate it. This is what destroyed camera. The third objection concerns the elasticity of meaning. Jung's criterion for whether two events belong together is that they mean the same thing, but meaning is supple. A skilled interpreter can find a correspondence between almost any two items because human beings are extremely good at metaphor. Without an independent measure of how close a match must be to count, the criterion cannot exclude anything, and a criterion that cannot exclude anything is not a criterion. The fourth objection is the falsifiability problem we met in the astrological experiment. If a positive statistical result supports the hypothesis and a negative one is explained by the researcher's own psyche interfering, the claim has removed itself from the reach of evidence. The fifth is simply the state of the evidence. Rhine's work has not replicated. Camera's method was invalid. Jung's own experiment produced a null result. There is, after 70 years, no positive body of control data. The empirical cupboard is bare. Any one of those is serious. Together they are, in my judgment, decisive against the strong claim, which is that there exists in nature a causal connecting principle operating alongside causality. I do not think that claim has been established. I think it is probably false. But I want to spend the next chapter on what remains standing after all 5 objections have done their work, because it is not nothing, and it is the part that concerns you. Chapter 31. The organ that finds patterns. Before we get to what survives, we should look squarely at the machinery that produces the experience, because it is real and well studied, and it is not an insult to you. Human beings are pattern detectors of extraordinary sensitivity. That sensitivity is not a bug. It is the most valuable thing our nervous system does. An organism that detects a pattern which is not there wastes a little energy. An organism that misses a pattern which is there gets eaten. The asymmetry in those costs has been shaping brains for a very long time, and the result is a system tuned to over-report rather than under-report. So we see faces in electrical sockets and figures in clouds and intention in weather. The technical term for finding meaningful patterns in random material is apophenia. The specific case of seeing faces is pareidolia. Neither is a disorder. Both are the ordinary operation of a well-built system at the edge of its range. Memory compounds it. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction performed fresh each time, and it is biased towards significance. Events that felt meaningful are consolidated and rehearsed. Events that felt like nothing are discarded within hours. So the archive you consult when you ask yourself whether coincidences happen has already been curated by a process that kept the coincidences. And there is a further effect which has a name, the frequency illusion. You learn a new word and then you encounter it 3 times in a week and it feels as though the world has responded. What has happened is that your detector for that word has been switched on, and the word was there all along at the same rate, and you were simply not registering it. You did not change the world, you changed the filter. I am giving you all of this because I think you should have it, and because the version of this subject that withholds it is not treating you as an adult. But notice carefully what all of it explains and what it does not. It explains why coincidences occur at the rate they do. It explains why we notice them. It explains why we remember them. It explains completely why a person lying awake can produce a list of uncanny events from their own life. It does not explain why some of them land, because they do not all land. Most coincidences are noticed, remarked upon, and forgotten within the hour. You see the same number twice, and you shrug. And then, perhaps 2 or 3 times in a whole life, one arrives that you are still carrying 20 years later, and the difference is not in the statistics. Statistically, the trivial ones and the enormous one are the same event. The difference is in what was happening to you at the time. Chapter 32. What is left standing? So let me put down as plainly as I can what I think genuinely survives. Once the physics is subtracted, and the parapsychology is subtracted, and the metaphysics is set aside. First, there exists a class of experience in which an outer event and an inner state correspond so precisely that the correspondence has psychological force. This is not in dispute, it is not a claim about physics. It is a claim about what happens to people, and the evidence for it is that it happens to almost everybody at least once. Second, these experiences are not distributed evenly across a life. They cluster. And they cluster, as far as anyone can tell, around periods of grief, of upheaval, of decision, of transition. Around the times when a person is unusually open and unusually raw, there is a mundane explanation for the clustering, and it is almost certainly correct. During those periods, your detector is turned all the way up because the situation is unresolved. and your mind is searching for anything that bears on it. Your threshold for significance has dropped, so you notice. Notice that this explanation, which is deflationary and probably true, agrees with Jung about the phenomenon and disagrees with him only about the mechanism. He said, "These events cluster around activated archetypes." The modern account says they cluster around heightened salience during emotional arousal. These are descriptions of the same curve. Third, and this is the piece that matters at this hour, the effect such an experience has on a person is not proportional to its evidential value. The scarab did not prove anything. It also worked. The woman's rationalism came down. Something in her that had been sealed opened, and the treatment moved. That is a real event with real consequences, and it happened by way of a coincidence that was, in all probability, just a coincidence. Which raises a question I find genuinely difficult, and I do not have a clean answer to it. Why should an event with no informational content change a person? The best answer I can give is this. Some things cannot be got at by argument, because argument operates on the part of the mind that is already defended. What gets past a defense is usually not a better reason. It is a shock, it is an interruption, it is the world doing something so precisely on the note you were already sounding that the coincidence, whatever its cause, breaks the surface. That is a claim about human beings, not about physics. It requires no causal connecting principle. And I think it is true. Chapter 33. The joke about the apparatus. There is a story attached to Pauli that I have kept until now because it belongs here, and because it is funny, and because at 3 a.m. you have earned something light. It was a standing joke among European physicists that experimental equipment failed in Pauli's presence. Not that he broke it, that it broke of its own accord when he entered the building. They called it the Pauli effect. The formulation was that a theoretician of Pauli's power could not be permitted near an apparatus because the apparatus would know. There are numerous anecdotes. The most cited concerns an expensive apparatus at the University of Göttingen which failed one morning for no discoverable reason. The physicist Otto Stern was said to have banned Pauli from his laboratory in Hamburg outright and to have conducted their conversations through a closed door. The most famous of them all is the incident at Göttingen where the equipment collapsed, and afterwards it emerged that Pauli had been passing through the town on a train which had stopped at the station at approximately the moment of failure. I want to be clear that this is a joke. It was understood as a joke by the people who told it, who were the most rigorous experimentalists alive. It functioned socially the way jokes do, as an affectionate way of saying that the man was formidable and that his arrival made everybody nervous, and nervous people knock things over. But here is why it is not merely a diversion. Pauli half believed it, not literally, and not as physics, but he was interested in it. He collected instances. He discussed it with Jung at length in the letters. He treated the folklore that had grown up around his own person as a piece of data about something, and he could not decide what. There is something almost unbearably human in that. The most exacting critic in 20th century science, the man who invented the phrase "not even wrong," kept a private file on the possibility that machines broke when he walked in. He was not stupid about it. He knew exactly what it looked like. He simply did not think it was beneath examination, and I would rather have that vice than its opposite. Chapter 34. Jung in the hospital. In February 1944, Jung slipped on ice, broke his fibula, and 10 days later, while recovering, suffered a serious heart attack. He was 68. He was, for a period, close to death and was being given oxygen and camphor. During this period, he had a series of experiences which he described many years later in his memoirs. He reported the sensation of being high above the earth, at a very great altitude, so that he could see the Indian subcontinent and the curve of the Mediterranean below him in a deep blue light. He described a great stone, a temple entrance, and an approaching sense that his whole life was being detached from him, that everything he had aimed at and wanted was falling away, and that this was not a loss. He then described being called back, and his considerable resentment at being called back, and a long depression afterwards, during which the ordinary world seemed to him thin and unconvincing. I want to be careful with this, and I am going to be blunt about what we know. There is a well-documented physiology of the dying and resuscitated brain. Cerebral hypoxia produces exactly this family of phenomena: the sense of elevation and detachment, tunnel vision from the pattern of retinal ischemia, autoscopy, profound feelings of significance, and the euphoria characteristic of oxygen deprivation. Add high-dose camphor and morphine and you have a fully sufficient account. So the physical description is complete. I am not going to pretend otherwise. And now recall Bohr and complementarity and Pauli's suggestion. The physical description being complete does not, by itself, close the experiential one. Jung's account is not a claim about the afterlife. He was careful in the memoir to say that he did not know what these experiences were. His claim was about the effect. He said the years after 1944 were the most productive of his life. Most of his major late work, including the alchemical studies and eventually the Synchronicity essay itself, came after that hospital bed. Something in him stopped being defended. He said so directly, that afterwards he affirmed what was and objected less, and that the depression which had followed his return had eventually resolved into an acceptance he had not had before. A hypoxic brain produced an experience, and the experience changed how a man lived for the remaining 17 years of his life and altered what he was willing to publish. The first fact does not cancel the second. That is the whole of what complementarity is asking you to hold. I want to press on this a little, because it is the single most useful idea in this entire recording, and because it is routinely misused in both directions. The misuse in one direction is to treat the physical explanation as a dismissal. Somebody describes an experience that reorganized their life, and the response is that it was only oxygen deprivation, only grief, only the drugs, only the hour. The word "doing the work" in each of those sentences is "only," and it is smuggled in. The physiology is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether naming the mechanism has told you what the event was for the person it happened to, and it plainly has not, because the mechanism is the same in cases where nothing whatever changes. The misuse in the other direction is to treat the experience as evidence against the physiology. It is not. Nothing about how profound an experience felt bears on what was happening in the tissue, and an argument that runs from the intensity of a feeling to a claim about the world is not an argument at all. Complementarity refuses both moves. It says, "Here are two accounts, both complete at their own level, neither derivable from the other, and the demand that one of them be the real one is a habit you acquired somewhere and never examined." That is not evasion. It is the most intellectually honest position available, and it is the one a Nobel laureate in physics arrived at by working on the structure of the atom, not by wanting to believe anything. And it applies to you tonight in the plainest possible way. There is a full physical description of what is happening in your body at this moment. There is also the fact that you are a person lying in a dark room at the end of a day thinking about your life. Both are complete. Neither is the truth behind the other. Chapter 35. 26 years of letters. The correspondence itself deserves its own chapter, because it is the actual achievement here more than the book. It ran from 1932 to 1958. The surviving letters were collected and published in German in 1992 and in English in 2001 under the title Atom and Archetype, and they are worth knowing about even if you never read them. What they show is two people changing each other slowly over decades. Pauli was the corrective. He went at Jung's language relentlessly. He objected to Jung's borrowing of the word energy, which in physics has a precise definition and a conservation law, and which Jung was using metaphorically for psychic intensity. He complained about the looseness of the archetype concept. He pressed on the difference between a genuine causal principle and a merely unknown cause. Jung took it, not gracefully at all times, but he took it and he revised. The 1952 essay is more careful than the 1951 lecture, and it is more careful because of Pauli. And Pauli moved too. He began as a patient with a problem. He became a collaborator with a thesis. By the end, he was writing to Jung about the deepest difficulties in his own field, about the mind-body problem, about the relation between the observer and the observed, in a register he used with nobody else. He also went on dreaming, and went on writing the dreams down, and going on, sending them to Zurich for 26 years. There is something in that which has nothing to do with synchronicity, and which is, I think, the real thing on offer tonight. A man in serious trouble wrote a letter to a stranger. The correspondence that resulted outlasted the trouble by a quarter of a century, and became the most sustained intellectual friendship in either of their lives, and ended only when one of them died. That is not a small return on an act which, at the time, felt to him like an admission of total failure. Chapter 36. The Last Years. Pauli's final years were professionally difficult in a way that is quiet and recognizable. In 1957 and 1958, he became involved in Heisenberg's attempt at a unified field theory, a nonlinear spinor equation that Heisenberg believed would account for the whole spectrum of particles. Pauli was enthusiastic at first. He worked on it intensely. He gave a lecture on it in New York in January 1958. Then he turned against it. He decided, with his usual finality, that the thing did not work, and he withdrew, and the withdrawal was bitter. There was a public embarrassment when Heisenberg described the theory on German radio as essentially complete and needing only technical detail, which Pauli regarded as a gross misrepresentation, and the friendship suffered badly. He was 57, and for the first time in his life, he had committed himself publicly to something and been wrong about it. At the same time, parity had fallen. In 1956, Li and Yang proposed that the weak interaction might not respect mirror symmetry, and in early 1957, Wu's experiment confirmed it. Pauli had been certain it would hold. He had written, shortly before the result, that he did not believe God was a weak left-hander. He was wrong, and he said so publicly and immediately, and he was shaken by it in a way his colleagues remarked upon. Symmetry had been the deepest of his convictions, and the world had declined to be symmetrical. He had spent 26 years arguing that ordering principles are real and shared between mind and matter, and nature had just informed him that one of the most beautiful of them was not, after all, a law. Chapter 37. The number. There is one number in physics that Pauli talked about more than any other, and it is not one of his own. It is called the fine structure constant. It is written with the Greek letter alpha. It measures the strength with which light and charged matter interact, which is to say, the strength of electromagnetism, which is to say, the force that holds every atom together and every molecule in your body in its shape. Its value is approximately 1 divided by 137. What makes it extraordinary, and what obsessed a generation of physicists, is that it is dimensionless. Most constants of nature carry units. The speed of light is so many meters per second, and the meter and the second are human conventions. So the number itself is partly an artifact of our choices. Alpha is not like that. It is a pure number. It is the same in any system of units, for any civilization anywhere, and it would be the same value written down by any species that got as far as electromagnetism. It comes out of no derivation. Nothing in physics explains why it has the value it has, rather than some other value. Richard Feynman, a generation later, wrote about it in terms that are worth reporting accurately, that it is one of the greatest mysteries in physics, a magic number that comes to us with no understanding, and that all good theoretical physicists put it up on their wall and worry about it. Pauli worried about it for his entire adult life. It was for him the specific point at which the question of whether number is fundamental to reality stopped being philosophy and became a bill that physics could not pay. Here was a bare integer, near enough, sitting at the foundation of matter with no explanation. He discussed it with Jung. Of course he did. It was the perfect object for the thesis they shared. A whole number at the root of the physical world, unexplained and apparently unexplainable, arriving from nowhere. He talked about it so often and so publicly that his colleagues made the obvious joke, which was that when Pauli died and got to ask God one question, it would be about alpha. Now, hold that. On the 10th of December, 1958, Pauli collapsed while lecturing. He was taken to the Rotkreuzspital, the Red Cross hospital in Zurich. He had pancreatic cancer, which was inoperable and far advanced. His assistant, Charles Enns, came to visit him. Pauli asked him whether he had seen the room number. The room was 137. He died there on the 15th of December, 1958. He was 58 years old. I am going to leave that alone. I will only say the two true things about it and let you do the rest, since you are lying in the dark, and this is exactly the sort of thing the dark is for. The first true thing is that this is a coincidence. Hospitals number their rooms. Room 137 exists in a great many buildings. Somebody has to be in it. A man who talked about a number for 40 years had, like everyone, a substantial chance of encountering it at any point, and we are hearing about this instance and not about the 40 years in which he was in rooms numbered something else. The second true thing is that it happened, and that he noticed, and that the last recorded question of the most exacting critic in 20th century physics, a man who spent his life refusing to let anyone get away with anything, was to ask whether somebody else had seen the number on the door. Both of those are true. Neither cancels the other. That is, as precisely as it can be put, the whole subject of tonight delivered in one room in December to a dying man. Chapter 38. The limits stated honestly. Let me now say clearly what I am not telling you, because it is late and you are suggestible, and I would rather be trusted in the morning. I am not telling you that the universe sends messages. There is no evidence of that, and Jung did not claim it. I am not telling you that your thoughts influence events. That claim is testable, has been tested extensively, and has failed. I am not telling you that coincidences in your life are signs or guidance or confirmation that you are on the right path. That belief is comfortable, and it is also a machine for confirming whatever you already wanted to do, and it will eventually be used to justify a decision you should not make. I am not telling you that the causal connecting principle exists. I have said plainly that I think it probably does not. And I want to add a caution which the honest version of this subject requires. The experience of everything being connected, of events arranging themselves around you with unmistakable significance, is also a recognized feature of certain kinds of psychological crisis. When it becomes constant, when the significance is pervasive and mounting, when the coincidences are addressed to you specifically and increasingly urgently, that is not an insight. That is a symptom, and it is one that people who care about you can help with. Jung, who spent his career in a psychiatric hospital before he ever had a private practice, knew that better than anyone and said so. So, the boundary is this. A coincidence that gives you pause is ordinary. A world that has begun speaking to you continuously is a reason to talk to somebody. Having drawn that line, let me tell you what I think you can honestly take. Chapter 39. What to do with your own. You have some, everybody does. Almost certainly you have between 1 and 3 events in your life which you do not talk about very often, and which you have never satisfactorily explained, and which you have not quite been able to discard either. There is a particular way people hold these. They tell the story, and then immediately, in the same breath, they say, "Of course, it was just a coincidence," and the qualifier is added so fast that it is clearly a defense rather than a conclusion. They are protecting themselves against being thought foolish, usually by somebody who is not even in the room. I want to propose a different posture, and it is Pauli's, not Jung's. Do not explain it. Do not explain it away, and do not explain it upward into significance either. Both of those are the same move. Both of them end the matter, and both of them are performed in order to end the matter, because an unresolved thing is uncomfortable to carry. Write it down, leave it alone. That is what he did with 1,000 dreams. He did not know what they were. He did not decide. He recorded them accurately, and he let them sit there being unexplained for years, until eventually somebody found a use for 400 of them. The capacity to hold something unresolved without forcing it into a category is not a mystical skill. It is closer to the basic discipline of any honest intellectual life, and it is exactly what both of these men were unusually good at. Jung sat on synchronicity for 30 years. Pauli sat on the fine structure constant for 40. Neither of them made a decision in order to feel better. There is a reason this is harder than it sounds, and it is worth naming so that you do not mistake the difficulty for a personal failing. An unexplained thing produces a low-grade discomfort that does not go away on its own. The mind treats an open question the way the body treats a splinter. It returns to it. And the fastest way to stop returning to it is to close it in either direction, because a closed question stops itching regardless of whether it was closed correctly. So both moves, the dismissal and the elevation, are performed for the same reason, and it is not a reason about truth, it is a reason about comfort. The skeptic who says it was obviously nothing, and the believer who says it was obviously a sign, have done identical work. They have converted an open item into a closed one, and they have both bought relief at the price of accuracy. Holding it open costs something. It costs a small permanent discomfort. That is the actual price, and nobody mentions it, and it is why almost nobody does it. What you get for the price is that you remain able to be surprised by the thing later. a closed item can teach you nothing further. An open one can still turn out to have been something you had not considered 10 years on, when you know more than you know now. And there is a practical benefit, which is that a coincidence you have not converted into a belief cannot be used against you. It cannot be recruited to justify a decision. It cannot be built into a system. It just sits there, unexplained, being one of the small number of things in your life you have been honest about. Chapter 40. 3 questions for an unexplained event. If you want something more structured, here are 3 questions, and they are the ones a careful person would actually ask. The first question: what was happening to me at the time? Not what happened, but what state you were in. Almost invariably, these events cluster at hinges: a bereavement, a diagnosis, the end of something, the week before a decision. If your striking coincidence arrived during the most ordinary month of your life, that is genuinely unusual and worth noting. If it arrived in the worst fortnight of a bad year, then the most likely account is that your threshold for noticing had dropped through the floor, and that is not a criticism of you. It is what grief does. Grief is a state of maximum searching. The second question: what would I have counted? Would a different beetle have counted? A moth? A bird at the window? If the answer is yes, then the target was wide, and a wide target is easy to hit. If the answer is genuinely no, that only this precise thing would have registered, then the event is more remarkable, and you should note that too, honestly, without inflating it. The third question, and this is the one that matters: what did it do? Set aside entirely the question of what caused it. That question is probably unanswerable and definitely not answerable by you at this hour. Ask instead what changed. Did you make a call you had been avoiding? Did you stop defending a position? Did something that had been shut open slightly? Because that is the part with consequences, and it is the part that is fully available to examination, and it is the only part that was ever really Jung's subject. The woman with the scarab did not learn anything about entomology. She stopped being sealed in. That was the event. Chapter 41. Against the comfortable version, I want to spend one chapter arguing against the popular form of this idea because I think it does harm, and because the difference between it and the real thing is the difference between something that helps you and something that quietly disables you. The popular version says, the universe is guiding you. Coincidences are signs. If it was meant to be, the way will open. Trust the signs. Here is what is wrong with it. It is unfalsifiable in the specific way that matters to a person rather than to a philosopher. When events go your way, the universe is confirming. When they do not, the universe is redirecting or testing or protecting you from something. There is no possible outcome that counts as the universe telling you that you were wrong, so it never tells you anything you did not already want to hear. It outsources responsibility. A decision made because of a sign is a decision you have not made. If it goes badly, it was meant, and if it goes well, it was arranged. Either way, you were not the agent. That is comfortable in the short term and corrosive over a life, because agency is not a feeling, it is a practice, and it atrophies, and it is cruel at the end. If good coincidences mean the universe is with you, then a run of terrible ones means the universe is against you, and people who have already been badly hurt then have to carry, on top of everything else, the suspicion that it was addressed to them personally. I have no interest in a consolation that does that to somebody at their worst hour. The version these two men actually argued is colder and I think better. There is no sender, there is no message, there is no guidance. There is possibly, at most, a structure of order that shows up in more than one place, and which is nobody's instrument and nobody's friend. That will not comfort you the way the other version does. It also will not turn on you. Chapter 42. The quiet version. So here, as plainly as I can put it, is the modest form of the idea, the one I think survives everything. Occasionally, the outside of your life and the inside of your life produce the same shape at the same time. There is no evidence that one causes the other. There is no evidence of any principle connecting them. The overwhelmingly likely explanation is that with enough events and a sensitive enough pattern detector, this will happen to everyone occasionally, and you notice it on the rare occasions when the inner shape is one you were already straining to see. And when it happens, it can do something that argument cannot do. It can get past the part of you that has an answer for everything. That is all. That is the whole of the defensible claim, and it is a claim about people and not about physics, and it requires nothing whatever to be true about the universe. Jung wanted more than that. He wanted it to be a principle in nature, and he spent 30 years trying to establish it, and he did not. Pauli wanted more than that too, and was too rigorous to say he had it, and died with the question open. But the modest version does not depend on either of them being right. It only requires that you have, at some point, been reached by something that had no business reaching you. Chapter 43. What they were actually after. I have been asking all night whether they were right. I want to spend a little time now on a different question, which is what they were doing. Because I do not think either of them was primarily trying to prove that coincidences are meaningful. I think they were both trying to repair a split, and the split was in them before it was in their subject. Jung's whole working life was spent on one side of a wall that the 19th century had built. Mind on this side, matter on the other. His profession sat awkwardly on the boundary, treating something that was clearly physical and clearly not only physical, with tools that could not decide which. And he had a personal reason for minding, which was his own long crisis, in which the interior had been more real than the world for the better part of 6 years. Pauli's whole working life was spent on the other side of the same wall, and he had watched the wall crack from that direction. The observer had turned out to belong inside the description. The clean separation had failed. Two men coming at one wall from opposite sides, both finding it in the wrong place. That is a serious project. It is arguably the central unsolved problem in philosophy, and it was not invented by them, and it has not been solved since. The mind-body problem is exactly as open now as it was in 1952. There is no accepted account of how the physical description and the experiential description are descriptions of the same event. Synchronicity was their attempt at a bridge. I think the bridge does not hold. But I would rather have the company of two people who admitted the gap and built badly across it than the company of people who pretend the gap is not there. And that, finally, is the thing to notice about the whole enterprise. Neither of them ever claimed to have finished. The essay ends in qualifications. The correspondence ends because a man died, not because a conclusion was reached. They left it open, on purpose, in public, with their names on it. Chapter 44. You are one case. Come back now to the pebbles in the river, because it is the thought I most want you to have as the night goes on. The average is real. It is not a lie, and it is not a trick. It is the best knowledge we have about collections of things. And you are not a collection. You are one case running once, and every statistical description of you is a description of a population you happen to fall inside, which is not the same as a description of you. That cuts both ways, and I want to give you both. It means that the reassuring numbers are not about you. The odds that it will be fine are not the same as it being fine. That is the hard direction, and you already know it, and it is probably part of why you are awake. And it means the discouraging numbers are not about you either. The base rate is not your rate. The distribution has no information about which side of it you are on. Jung's argument, stripped of everything speculative, was that the single case has been methodically deleted from our picture of the world, and that we then mistook the deletion for a discovery. You are the deleted term. The whole of your life, everything that has actually happened, is the residue that the method discards in order to work. That is not a mystical claim. It is arithmetic, and it means that the events which mattered most in your life are precisely the events which would appear in no table anywhere, and that their absence from the table is not evidence of anything at all. Chapter 45. The two of them at the end. Pauli died in December 1958. In the room with the number on the door, he was 58. Jung outlived him by 2.5 years. He died at Kusnacht in June 1961, at the age of 85, in the house with the inscription over the door, looking out at the lake. Neither of them settled it. Jung's last major work was on the myth of the flying saucer, which he read not as a claim about aeronautics, but as a modern instance of a very old image, a circle in the sky arriving over a divided world at the height of the Cold War. It was, predictably, misread and used against him again. Pauli's last work was the failed unification and a public reversal, and the collapse of the symmetry he had believed in most. Two men who had spent their lives being right, ending on things they got wrong. I find that more encouraging than the alternative, and I want to say why. A person who ends their working life having been right about everything has almost certainly stopped taking risks somewhere around the middle of it. The only way to arrive at the end with a clean record is to stop asking questions that could embarrass you. Neither of them did that. At 77 and at 52, with nothing left to gain and reputations that could only be damaged, they published the least defensible thing either of them had, because they had been arguing about it for 20 years and thought the argument was worth putting on the record. That is not a small way to finish. Chapter 46. What to keep. We are near the end now, and there is nothing further to work out, so let me simply set down what is worth keeping, slowly, and then we can let the rest go. Keep the letter. A man at the top of his profession, in the worst year of his life, decided that his difficulty was not an exception to his own standards of honesty, and wrote to a stranger. Everything else in this story follows from that. Keep the refusal. Jung would not take him as a patient because he did not want to contaminate the material. Care about the truth of a thing can look from outside like turning down an opportunity. Keep the notebook. 1,000 dreams written down, not interpreted, not dismissed, left alone to be unexplained for years. Keep the pebbles. The average is not you. Keep the complementarity. 2 complete descriptions, neither reducible to the other, both required. The physical account of what is happening to you tonight is true, and it is not the only true thing. Keep the 3 questions. What was happening to me? What would I have counted? What did it do? And keep the room number and hold it exactly as loosely as it deserves. It was a coincidence, he noticed. Both of those are the case. Chapter 47. The hour lets go. The hour you are in has a shape, and it is worth naming it, now that we are nearly through it. It is the hour when the mind, having no external work, begins to go over its own records. It goes over them because that is what it is for. The pattern finder does not switch off because the lights are out. It simply runs out of world and starts on memory. And what it produces at this hour feels unusually significant. And the reason it feels unusually significant is the same reason a coincidence does. Your threshold has dropped. Everything is nearer the surface. The ordinary filters that keep a Tuesday afternoon manageable are not fully in place. That is worth knowing, because it means the weight of the thoughts is not evidence of their importance. The 3 in the morning version of your life is not the true version underneath the daytime one. It is the same life, examined by a system running with the gain turned all the way up, so you can let it go on without joining it. The mind can turn over its material, and you can decline to conclude anything from it, because concluding things at this hour is precisely the activity that keeps you awake. Nothing has to be decided tonight. Nothing has to be understood. The 2 men we have spent these hours with had 26 years and a Nobel Prize between them, and did not settle it either, and both of them slept most nights eventually. The room is dark. The house has made its noises and finished. Somewhere a long way off there is a car, and then there is not. You are one case, running once, and no table anywhere contains you, and there is nothing at all you need to do about that before morning. Chapter 48. The End of the Night. There is a beetle at a window, in a house on a lake, in a year a long time ago now, and a woman who could not be reached, and a man who opened the window and caught it. Nobody knows what that was. It was almost certainly nothing. It changed her anyway. There is a man in a rented room writing down a dream about two circles at right angles to each other, 32 divisions, 4 colors, 3 rhythms, and a ring that had formerly been dark and was now golden. He did not know what it meant. He wrote that it gave him an impression of the most sublime harmony, and he had not used a phrase like that before and did not use it often again. There is a hospital corridor in December and a number on a door, and a man noticing it and saying nothing else about it. None of it proves anything. All of it happened. That is the whole of what I have for you, and it is enough, and the rest of the night is yours. Let the ideas go now. They will be here. They have been here since 1952, and they are in no hurry, and nothing in them requires you to remain awake. Let your breathing find its own rate. It has been doing this a long time without your supervision. Let the day settle. It is finished, whatever it was, and it does not need reviewing, and the review would not improve it. There is no problem in this room. There is a bed and the dark and a body that has been carrying you around all day and would now like to be still. The circles are turning quietly somewhere, at right angles to each other, and the ring around them is gold, and none of it needs watching. Sleep now.